So tonight we're going to talk about your work, about this amazing book that I curled up with for an entire weekend. And I want to start by talking about a quote at the end of the book. And the quote, Ralph is talking about, coming full circle in 80 years of living and making pictures. And he says, "Doubtless of the greatest decisions I have made can be reduced to a handful of instances. Of course, the first important decision I made was to commit to photography. The second was to use only the Leica. The third was to practice yoga every morning. The fourth was to eschew commercial photography and concentrate entirely on my personal work. The fifth great decision was to share my life with Mary Jane. The sixth was to stop drinking. And more recently, the seventh was to move to digital photography." And there we have it, 80 years in 7 decisions.
We can all go home.
So I thought some of those 7 decisions could carry us through a conversation this evening.
Sure, good idea.
So one of those decisions, you had a life-changing event when you joined the Navy.
Yes, indeed.
Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I'll be brief but intense. I had a very glamorous childhood, and I was a kid actor and on the set and everything, as Annie just described. Very Hollywood, knew a lot of movie stars and all that during a period of 40s and 50s. But then, due to alcoholism, my family broke up, and I was out of the house at 16. I had failed high school. I thought I'd failed my family. And so my father gave me the choice of military school or the Navy, and I was afraid of military school, so I wound up in the Navy. And at 5:30 in the morning, they said, "We're going to put you in aerographer school," the guy in the control tower. I said, "I don't care." They said, "Well, if you don't care, there's somebody who really wants it. We'll send you to photo school." I said, "I don't care." So I went to photo school and promptly failed. So by 17, I had reached a serious nadir. And I wrote the captain a letter asking to be readmitted to photo school. And there wasn't going to be a new class for me for 6 weeks, so I cleaned the barracks latrines for 6 weeks. Very humble beginning in photography. But I sailed through with flying colors, and then on my first command, crossing the North Atlantic, I was standing watch around 3 in the morning in the fantail, and hail and lightning and thunder, and I was miserable. And I shouted up at the heavens, "I'm going to be a photographer." And I guess I'm still shouting because it was a vow. It was a vocation. It was like somebody receiving $100 million on their 21st birthday. It gave me everything that I had lacked up to that moment.
Purpose?
Well, I knew what my destiny was. I knew sort of what I was going to become. I knew what next steps to take, which in those days I had slept on an air mattress in the darkroom, and I just studied photography, studied the technical aspects of it, which in the 50s, that was most of what photography was. It was a very ordinary medium. The films were slow, the lenses were slow. You mixed developers from bulk, and so they were inconsistent. Light meters didn't really work. Which is why Ansel, whom you mentioned earlier, made such an important manifestation with his books on the darkroom. And I should say that I did know Ansel. He was the first guy. He invited me to do a workshop in 1970 at Best and Company, and I was the first 35mm photographer that he essentially acknowledged. But I have to tell this story. I'll be very brief. So at the end of the workshop, he came and he's going to give a demonstration of the zone system, which in this crowd, you'll like this story. So Ansel went to the blackboard, and the horse's mouth, the zone system, expansion, contraction, plus, minus, this and that. And at the end of this very lucid demonstration, I said, "Ansel, how did Edward Weston compute his exposure?" And he said, "Well, Ralph, Edward, he would take a broad overall reading of the scene, and then he'd give it another stop. So then you had two opposing views of how to expose for film.
So after the Navy, another milestone was when Dorothea Lange told you that you needed a point of departure.
This is huge, yeah. You know, I was only in art school for 3 months, and then and I realized I was shooting that there was a certain number of clicks existing between where I was and what I hoped to become, and so that was a straight line. But because I was so advanced technically, Dorothea called the school and needed an assistant, and I was clearly the one. And so I went over there. No competition in that regard. I went over there, and here's this little old lady, and I'm in her darkroom, and in the first 15 minutes, I could tell she didn't know much about how the chemicals worked or things like that. It was the sheer force of her will, her intention, that compelled the medium to obey her. And we would spend all day printing. She would call me the night before. She said, buy this kind of paper, buy that kind of paper, go down to Brooks Cameras. And in those days, there were many brands of photo papers, and we'd print Migrant Mother or something all day long. And at the end of the day, we couldn't tell which was the best one. But one day she said, you may show me your work, Raphael. And I showed her my early stuff, street shooting stuff, early Leica stuff. And she said, I see your problem, you have no point of departure. I said, that's true, Dorothea, what is a point of departure? She said, well, if you're going down to the drugstore to buy toothpaste and you have your camera, the fact that you're motivated means you might intersect a significant event worth photographing. But if you just drift around the street like you are, you'll never come up with anything. And it was only virtually 10 years later when I was working on the Somnambulist that I realized, see, if I'm working on the Somnambulist, I look at this glass and I said, is this pencil next to the glass? Is that part of my dream? I have a point of departure. Otherwise, I might just say, oh, I think I'll take a picture of this red pencil next to the black thing. So whatever got me into this chair tonight is the fact that I don't ever touch my camera since 1970 without a point of departure. One project to the next, and towards the end of each project, they're harbingers of the subsequent project that is yet to come. And I got this from Madame, that little lady, and it was probably the biggest break in my life. After I decided to be a photographer, Dorothea gave me the key to becoming such. And to this day, I do workshops all over the world. I have passionate amateurs, people who love photography, very advanced, but just show me their boxes of prints, and they don't commit to a project. And one of the reasons people don't commit to projects, to doing books, to doing major bodies of work, is fear of failure. And if you don't do something because you're afraid you're going to fail, you failed in front. You've already failed. And I cannot overstress the point of departure.
I'm going to move on here. So one of the most moving parts of the book for me was you were explaining how your mom died in a fire in California, and you were visiting the site, and
well, what happened was my parents divorced, and they sold the house, and my mother took her half and went to beautician school and got a beauty parlor.
Okay.
And she stayed alcoholic, and she died in a flop house, Bunker Hill fire. And I walked through the ashes, and I saw these little things I'd given her as a kid, in kindergarten and stuff. And I just sealed myself.
No emotion?
I wouldn't let myself feel anything. And then a couple of years later, I'm walking down the street on 6th Avenue, and I see this burning beauty parlor. And I'm pulled over there by a force, and I take this picture, and the catharsis of the tears comes out. So my relationship to the medium, as I wrote in the book, I said, I realized I didn't want to be a commercial photographer. I didn't want to sell my soul in photography. I wanted to find it. You have an experience like that with your camera, and it pretty well means that you're on a different path. which I was very fortunate to be able to follow. You know, this was in 1969. I made The Somnambulist, and everything was perfect. The medium was at the right place. It was a time to do that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm big on the infrastructure of my society that enabled me to be an art photographer when they didn't exist, really. You know.
And it was such a different aesthetic than the modernist.
Well, yes, you know, back to the Navy days in the 50s, I'd look at Pop Photo and the annuals, and it was all about the great documentary photographers, the modernists, Cartier-Bresson, all the wonderful, and that's what I wanted to be. But then all of a sudden I'm using my work. I wanted to be in Magnum. I came to New York in '67, and Danny Lyon and Mary Ellen Mark and myself are presented to Magnum, and I'm the one they took.
And that was an ambition of yours.
Yeah, so here I am in Magnum after 10 years of dreaming about it. I didn't like it. I started taking this picture, and I said, you know, I'm not really a documentary dude. You know, Danny is a great documentary photographer. Mary Ellen was fabulous. I didn't want, with the advent of this picture of the beauty parlor, I didn't want the subject matter to be supporting the content. I wasn't going to wait for the big moment, you know. So.
And then New York.
Yeah, New York.
1966.
Well, I came to New York, and I was going to. I had $200. I drove a van for Bruce Davison, who had been working in L.A., and he got called back, and he said, if you drive my truck, my camper back to New York, I'll give you.
And who did you drive it with?
A guy named Bill Etheridge, yeah. And we drove to New York, and I had $200, and my rent was paid for a week at the Chelsea. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know what? I ain't going back. I'm not going back to LA. This is where I belong. And then I met Robert, and I got Magnum, and then I dropped out. And it took me from 67 to 70, it was a very difficult time. I dropped out of Magnum. I didn't have any income. I was pawning my cameras. At one point, I owed 9 months' rent at the Chelsea Hotel. The rent was $200 a month.
You would go down to Max's, though. You would go to Max's.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd go to Max's every night. Max's, Kansas City, everybody. I mean, you know, I could drop all the big names. You know them all. Everybody was just around. Everybody was just starting out. It was a great time to be in New York. You know.
Talk about Mary Ellen Mark.
Well, I met Mary Ellen at that presentation, and it was a big. She was stop traffic beautiful, and she was very inspired, and we started a relationship which was very much off and on for 10, 15 years until I met my wife and she met her husband, Martin. And what's interesting about her widower, Martin Bell, is that he has the same birthday as I do, January 16. Now, I don't know if you're into astrology or anything like that. But Mary Ellen wanted it really badly. In those days when you were freelance,
ambitious, weren't you?
we were all, yeah. We all, but you know, you'd get a job and it would pay $100 a day, $150 a day. They'd give you a day rate. And you're supposed to bring the job back a week later. Well, what she would do is she would work for 5 days and walk in with supposedly 1 day's work. And of course the editors loved that. And she, Mary Ellen, as I mentioned in your office earlier, to the very end, held fast and firm to the belief that you could do good work on assignment. You could be creative on assignment. And the paradigm, who we'll discuss later, was Eugene Smith,
right,
of this ethic, which is so brutal and so damaging, so difficult to work at the peak of your creativity for a magazine or an art director, and then have the pictures, you know, turned upside down or cut in half or something.
Another 1977, another very important year. 1978? 1978.
Yeah, yes, I met my wife, Mary Jane, who some of you have met, and she said, "What are you writing about me in the book?" And she said, "Are you saying that it was love at first sight?" you know. And so I thought about it for a while, and then I came up with one. I said, seeing Mary Jane for the first time was like recalling music heard in a dream. She liked that. That did the trick.
Yeah.
But, you know, but one of the things I said in my chapter on her was that to describe why I love her would take the 40 years that we've been together. Yeah. You see, it would take me another 40 years to tell you everything, or to try to understand it. But this is, you see, I had a career, I had a vocation, then I found great love. You know, I've asked a lot of, I live in New York, and all my collectors are retired CEOs and titans of industry and stuff. At one point or another, I usually ask them, how did you do it? How did you succeed? You know, I've asked generals, I've asked all kinds of people, and they all give me the same answer. They say, well, I was really good at what I did, and I worked really hard, and I was lucky. Now, everybody, the average age in this group tonight is well over 50. And you probably recognize some truth in what I just said. You work really hard, you're good at what you do, but then you catch that break. You know, no man is an island.
So Ralph, your archive sits next to the other masters of photography upstairs, and, you know, including Eugene Smith. And I wonder what it was like touring with the greatest photojournalist of our time. I mean, what was that like? You went on a lecture tour with him.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Well, first of all, I want to back into it because I had studied Gene obsessively, and there's a term called elliptical where you can write a letter saying grandma got sick after a long illness and many doctors came, and now she finally, after weeks and weeks, succumbed, and funeral will probably be sometime next week. You can write a letter, or you can send a telegram. Granny died, funeral tomorrow. Very elliptical, 4 words. In the syntax, the semiotic of photojournalism, which at one time, when Gene was at his peak, was the delivery system for otherwise unattainable information. Gene distanced himself from all the other Magnum heavies simply by one key factor, which is if you look at Albert Schweitzer sitting at his desk with the lantern, and then the next picture is a goat on the roof in the rain. Mm-hmm. This is elliptical because if a regular journalist would need 10 pictures, Gene could tell the story in 1, 3, 7, and 9. And you'd get even a bigger picture because he could build pictures between pictures in the viewer's perception. And so I knew this very early on, and I had a little company, Lustrum Press, and Gene was in darkroom theory, and I hung with him for a while, and we went on this lecture tour. And he could see visually and communicate elliptically, which you don't say that of other great documentary photographers. They don't do it. It was just his way of speaking, which of course brought him to loggerheads with his editors, you know, who always wanted to reconfigure his sequences, and he shot himself in the foot many times, blew lots of big fat contracts, and but we went on this lecture tour where I would open for him, you know, show this in ambulance deja vu or something, and tell my little story, and then he had just Minimata had come out, and you know, just he had been beat up, and you all know the story of Minimata. But one of the things, it was about mercury poisoning in the fishing village in Japan, where children were born thalidomide because of the pollution. And so the essay focused on Tomiko, who was her mother, and Tomiko was one particularly disfigured child who was born with a great many defects. And so during the lecture, Gene would say, Ralph, would you bring me some water? So I'd bring him a glass about this big, and it'd be full of vodka. And I'd set it in front of him, thank you, Ralph. And then he'd start sipping from it and start talking about Minamata. And by the time the glass was down here, he was pretty well plastered, and he could say, Tomiko, I love you. And he'd start crying. You see, he wouldn't have been able to get those tears up without the vodka. But you know, the other thing about Gene was that he was a great camera handler, but he was more on the lens side of the deal. He had the broadest vocabulary of any working journalist of the times in terms of his lenticular optical. He just used everything.
Really?
He used every focal length from a 21 to a 400, and with equal bravado, you know.
Wow.
Are my stories too long?
They are not too long.
Okay.
They're wonderful stories.
I've heard them all.
You want to talk about Robert Frank?
Sure, Robert. Well, you know, when I was still an art student in Frisco.
He wanted to take pictures. He didn't want to take pictures.
Huh?
He didn't want to take pictures with you.
Well, first I met him in the early 60s when the Americans was, you know, all anybody looked at. And he came to San Francisco to lecture, and I said, can I show you my work? And he said, well, if you ever come to New York, yeah, maybe call me. And I ran into him at Max's, you know, 7, 8 years later. And I mentioned, you know, he was sitting at a table. Well, in those days, I'll get to this. So I went to see him the next day, showed him my work, and he says, well, I'm not doing pictures anymore, but I'm working on movies. If you like, you can work with me. I could use some help. And it wasn't a full-time job. It was when he was shooting something, he'd call up and it'd be a few days. Then we traveled to Mexico together, and we became friends. And Danny Line was around. We were, you know, there were a bunch of, but I lived in his house for a while. But the best story is, we were working on me and my brother, and he said, I might fall flat on my face on this, but at least I'm going to do something original. And it brought back something Dorothea had said to me. She had once said, you can only be yourself, Raphael, the rest is just a name. Meaning you had to be true to your own kind of photography and not imitate. And so now the two greatest photographers I ever met, Dorothea and Robert, are telling me that you have to be as original as you possibly can, as unique. And so...
But you can't force that.
No, you can't force it, but you could sure as hell want it. And that tends to help.
Yeah.
People can love my work or hate it, but they tend to recognize it's mine.
Yeah.
You know, and one time we were working on, me and my brother, out in the country, or no, Conversations in Vermont, and I had a Leica with a 28 on it, M2. And Robert says, you think you're pretty good at that, don't you? I show you when you don't know. Now you remember he lived on 10th Street with all the abstract expressionists, and he'd shoot with one hand, and he was very gestural, and that's part of the power of the Americans, part of how he accessed certain things, you know, by really relaxing. So he took my camera, put on a self-timer, bzzz, threw it up in the air, we all looked up, took our picture, and he caught it coming down. Now that's a gestural photograph. You know, the landscape was all skewed and everything, but it did show me something I didn't know. You know, it was a bigger lesson than I thought. It's a great story, but it also, art is always discussed in conventional terms of form and content. Content is what it says, form is what supports it. If you can see what it says, the form was sufficient enough to hold it. Mm-hmm. In commercial photography, you sometimes have all form and no content, you see. But you cannot have content without form. Mm-hmm. So Robert, probably his greatest contribution, certainly from where I sit, was in his camera handling virtuosity. He just kicked open the door like Pollock pushed the painting off the easel, pushed the canvas down on the floor. Oh, so there's some possibilities now that didn't exist before. You know, when Pollock broke with 19th century painting, he broke with 1,000 years history when he threw the canvas on the floor. Robert had a lot of that in him. I've been going to see him. He's very, very old now. But I'll tell you a story. You're all old enough. It's in the book. One day he said to me, he says, "You think photography is hard? You should try fucking."
Okay. It's all about perspective, right? Okay. So I'm going to go to a topic that I'm sure a lot of people are interested in. And when I read this part of the book, I thought it was really compelling, and it just made me want to ask more questions. So let's talk about digital and analog. And you say in the book that there are definite differences in the way the subject is rendered and the way the image speaks. Can you expand on that and also touch on what you describe as the dogma of Photoshop?
Okay.
Okay?
Now, would you like the 1 minute or the 5 minute or the?
I don't know, Brian. How much time do we have? The 1 minute or the? We got 5.
The situation is this. By the time in 2012, I was lecturing in Sydney at the museum in the new gallery, Art Gallery in New South Wales. It's like the Metropolitan Museum in Sydney. 800 people in the audience. And I'm talking about my work. I said, "Any questions? What's your name, sir?" He said, "I'm Dave." I said, "Excuse me?" "I'm Dave." "Sorry, sir." "My name is Dave." "I'm Dave." You know, so he asked me about, what do you think of digital? And I had prepared an answer. I said, the history of photography has been etched into the emulsion of black and white film, and digital will resist the epic pursuit.
That's very
impressive. So that kind of finished off Dave, and so I went back to my studio in New York a few days later, and Leica, some guys from Leica come and they were doing a monochrome camera. It only shoots black and white. We'd like you to endorse it, put your name on it, and we'd make a limited edition. I said, "I'm not really interested." They said, "Well, could we send you the prototype?" I said, "Sure." And so it came, and I took this picture of the bicycle. Yeah, that one. That's the first picture I took. And it looked like a picture from San Francisco in 1961. So the first picture, I'm laying on my shrink's couch talking about this prototype. I put it on automatic, and I go out of her office and I take that picture. And I looked at the display in the back, and I said, "You know, that looks like it could have been taken by me." And I realized that this camera was going to reflect my vision instantly. I'd been a photographer maybe 55 years by that time. I kind of knew what I was doing. And you know, in those 55 years in the darkroom, I did all my own printing and developing. So I calculated once that I was actually in darkness, or at least under the amber light, if not total blackness, for maybe 25 years. That's called solitary confinement. So I had slowed down, is what I'm getting at. I knew that I wasn't going to learn much more from my materials. I used to imagine when I'd photograph on film, I used to imagine the light rays coming through the lens, refracting through the object, the different lenses, and then penetrating and warming the emulsion of the film, temperature-wise. Then when I'd developed the film, I'd imagine the emulsion would swell and this fluid would go down and hit the silver. I was looking for the organic component. I had a real relationship to my materials. I live in the art world. I talk to sculptors. I talk to painters about the resistance of canvas, different canvases, the different paints, the different kinds of bristle. And I was slowing down. I was doing more music. I didn't enjoy the darkroom. I didn't have the energy for it. And I didn't need it as badly because my vision was more formed from the darkroom, so I was just going more directly to the picture. So then I get this picture, and to make a long story short, since that day, I have not loaded film. 6, 7 years now. Now, here's what digital does. I could describe this chair. This is a chair with a number 4 on it. It folds. That's in English. Il y a une chaise là avec le numéro 4 qui se plie. That's in French. Same chair, different language. Now, the difference is in the syntax. So let's discuss the syntax of digital. Anything digital is compressed. Video, music, banking, telephones, ordering on Amazon. Anything that gets that has a pixel that is digitized is compressed. I had my mono, and I've worked for 99% of the pictures in my career have been with a 50 millimeter lens. That was one of my decisions many years ago. I know a lot about the 50 at all different distances, different lights, different f-stops, different proportions, different focal points. And I started noticing in my first work, mono, that it looked like I was taking these pictures with maybe a 58 or 59 millimeter lens. I could see there was a compression, a little foreshortening. Mm-hmm. And I surmised that this was a characteristic, an organic component of how light affects the sensor. And I had a show of mono at Wetzlar at the Leica factory. I said, it's a 58, and the perspective is a 50. They didn't like it at all, that I said it compresses. Well, now, my point of departure for the last 3.5 years has been with the 135 on the rangefinder. Ralph and Elliot are the only 2 guys you'll ever know who hold up a rangefinder Leica with the 135 on it. So.
Now, you also say in the book that you 99 or 85%, something around that, that you only shoot vertical.
Yeah, that's another thing. Well, that started way back when, for different reasons. Mm-hmm. Because, but anyway, I'm using a lens that compresses, a 135, in a medium that compresses, and I'm getting pictures every day. It's very satisfying. Yeah. But the reason I shoot vertical is very simple. I'm not a storyteller. I don't have any allegory. There's no narrative going on. The proportion of narrative in the West, or now the whole world, is horizontal. Cinema, television, computer screen. It's only recently with the cell phone that there's been any vertical. If you look at me with 2 eyes, you're seeing you close one eye and things get vertical real fast. And I like the tensions that I get in the frame with vertical. I hardly ever shoot a horizontal. I was once going to apply for a Guggenheim to shoot horizontals. Good thing I didn't, because I wouldn't have got it.
What about that dog neck?
Now, you know, there's been people, we know the 810 shooters love the long scale, 250 grays and stuff like that, and that seems to be a means to an end in and of itself. Just a picture of a rock, a dog in fog, but look at those tones. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the less you know about Photoshop, the better, because the better you get at Photoshop, the more it leads you to that same conclusion that you see in all those galleries where they're selling those big pictures of the canyons for $250, you know, razor sharp. You know, that kind of photograph. Those are people who are really good at Photoshop. So whatever you do, don't get good at Photoshop, because you'll wind up at that same place. The dogmatic aspect of it is that it sends you to its preferred conclusion. So I just navigate a very, very fine little path through it. I do my separations, I just color, I prepare my books for reproduction in Photoshop. And, I'm friends with the painter Eric Fischel, who used to just give me so much guff when I was shooting C negative. He said, look at those photomechanical colors, they're just so ugly, you know, compared to what a painter can do. And now I'm really enjoying color a lot, because I can get the colors that I want.
I have 2 more questions.
Is there a God?
Music echoes photography in that the act and the idea are one and the same. Ralph Gibson.
Yes. Since I had that idea, I would have added, can you separate the dancer from the dance? I've been a guitarist since I was 13. And in the Navy, in the darkroom, had a classical repertoire. I studied classical Villalobos, and I knew how to read, and then I played rock and roll with Larry Clark through the 70s. I tell this story in the book where we're playing this rent party, and we look out and there's Ornette Coleman dancing. We're playing a really bad version of Johnny B. Good. We shut down, you know. He walks up to the dance and he says, "You guys are sounding better." Better than what? But when I got in my 60s, I thought, you know, I'm gonna get this monkey off my back. I'm going to study theory and harmony and composition. Because as I moved through middle age, I started thinking that, you know, I'd really like to fulfill my potential. I'd like to know, in this case, how much music is in me. How do I liberate it? So I studied theory and harmony. If you come to my event tomorrow night, you'll hear, I only play my own music. I don't play other people's stuff. I just do what I do. So I did come up with this idea that we know that photography has a relationship to reality. I could take a picture of the out of focus light, and you can tell what it was, and it would be 100% photography, but no matter how abstract my pictures get, you can always tell what the subject is. I want to be right on the cusp. So we'll say that reality is to photography what melody is to music. We know about sound and noise and atonality and things like that. Well, I'd like to be right on the cusp. And I asked Philip Glass, I said, Philip, what do you think of this idea? Reality is to photography what melody is to music. And he said, yes. He said, well, I could do without melody, but I could never do without harmony. He considered harmony more of an intrinsic characteristic of music than melody. So I continue to examine these ideas, but in spite of this theory, this
I could apply that to
observation.
life.
Huh?
I could apply that harmony to life.
I suppose you
I
could.
mean, you could.
Yeah. Sometimes I make things that are rather sweet. I make compositions, they just come out fully formed. That sound kind of vanilla, but I don't know. We try to deconstruct them. This is H.S. Kim, that's in Korea. That's at the
Really?
Bird Nest Museum. That's
Really?
the Zaha Hadid's museum. Yeah. Face, post face.
You decided that your archive was going to come to the center in your 30s, right?
Well, thanks
So-
to a great man named Harold Jones.
Yes.
A great man, whom I hold in the highest regard.
Well, tell me what it means to you to have your archive here.
Well, it means that my grieving widow is not going to have to deal with what I see other grieving widows deal with all the time now. All the time. These people leave behind these Rocky Mountain ranges of chaos called a lifetime of work. Formless, amorphous, good, bad, who knows, who cares. What does it mean? And as a result, there's no infrastructure, there's no architectonic to their entire career. So when Harold approached me, I was maybe 33 or 4, and I said, well, what do you want to know? He said, all our archives are of dead photographers. We don't know anything about the creative process in living photography. So I send all my correspondence, and I fill up boxes on a regular basis, and my will is very, very precisely inscribed what's to come to the center upon my inevitable demise. So,
Were you thinking about your legacy at 33?
no, only in the most hagiographic sense.
Ah. Okay.
It was just it was an opportunity to do something that somebody with greater foresight than I proposed.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm glad I said that.
Yeah.
I hope somebody tells him I said that.
We'll tell him who said that. Will there be an 8th decision?
Oh, sure.
Will you come back and share it with us?
Yeah.
You don't have to come up with it.
I know. I realized that I just turned 80 last month, and
Happy birthday.
thank you.
Are you a Capricorn?
Definitely. I
turned
wish I
50
were an Aquarian, but
I
I
turned
said
50 last week.
50. That's puberty. I mean,
Oh, good. That's fun.
50. Well, when I
And I'm an
turned 50,
Aquarian.
and you're an Aquarian.
Yes,
Oh, they're
absolutely.
the best. The
Yeah.
Aquarians.
We're water bears.
They're always the visionaries. When I turned 50, this very elegant Frenchman told me, "Vous êtes à votre apogée." You're at your apogee because you have all your youthful strength, but now you have an adult mind.
Ah,
It's
I
a
grew up.
perfect. It's a perfect place to be. Yeah,
lovely.
yeah. So.